Will France really go back to being France on Monday? Will the English Channel grow narrower with Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party in charge in the UK? And what have been our guests' Olympic highlights? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Welcome to the Monocle Daily live from Paris. I'm Andrew Muller. It's the final weekday of our residency here on the 16th floor of the Sceaux Hotel in the centre of the French capital, taken over during this Olympic fortnight by Maison Allianz, the worldwide insurance partner of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. My guests Michele Barbero and Simon Cooper will discuss the day's big stories, plus we'll hear from one of the people responsible for getting the new Olympic sport of breaking up to the gate. That's all coming up on the Monocle Daily live from Maison Allianz at the Sceaux Hotel. And welcome to the Monocle Daily live from Paris. I'm Andrew Muller and I am joined today by Michele Barbero, Deputy Chief Editor at AFP TV Live, that is a lot of initials, and by Simon Cooper, Financial Times journalist and author of Impossible City, a book on the Paris of today. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
I just want to take this possibly final opportunity for the Daily to gloat about the incredible view that we have had from up here. We do still have, I think it's important to note, morning shows due on Saturday and Sunday, but this will be the last Daily from up here. Simon, I know I asked you about this just before we went on air. I'm going to ask you again. Can you in fact see your house from up here?
Well, the thing about Paris is that so many houses look exactly the same because Houseman had OCD. So it might be, but I'm not sure.
Michele, you can't though.
I can't just because I live in the far south, not even in Paris proper, so...
No, never mind. But you can sort of see vaguely the direction you live in, right?
Absolutely.
Well, that'll do. We will start here in Paris. In fact, we'll be staying here in Paris both thematically and literally throughout this programme. And on Sunday, Paris's Olympic flame will be doused. And on Monday, France will return to business and politics as usual. The Olympic fortnight may have bought President Emmanuel Macron an amount of time to figure out what to do with the results of the snap parliamentary election he called in the weeks before the Games began. At some point, however, he will have to make some decisions, which, if history is any guide, will make a reasonably hefty cohort of French people volubly unhappy. Simon, first of all, do you anticipate that France will just go quickly back to being France?
Yes. I was looking at a study of happiness of the London Olympics. Happiness rises sharply the day of the opening ceremony, sustained high through the Games, and then it collapses to the previous level of before the Games.
So it's a bit of a drunken haze for everybody involved.
I fear so, yes. It would be lovely to think that Paris would always be like this.
Michele, do you think the French will extend any lasting credit to the president for how well these Games have gone?
That's a good question. I don't think so.
God, I hope he's not listening.
I was speaking to an analyst recently. He was saying, even when the Games work super well, people remember about the Games, but not about the people who organize them. And if anyone will... get some benefits from these Olympics, I think it will be mainly Anne Hidalgo, the Paris mayor. I think she will be the one who will really benefit from a strictly political standpoint about how well these Games went, the ceremony and the whole event. And she will likely run again for mayor of Paris in a couple of years' time. So,
I mean, Simon, there is in France, as in most places, a bit of a divide between the capital and the rest of the country, the dynamics of that divide are usually that the capital kind of forgets the rest of the country actually exists and the rest of the country resents the capital for forgetting that it exists. Is it possible, therefore, that the focus on Paris might actually widen that divide? Do you think the rest of France has joined in with Paris's enjoyment of these Games?
There's a little bit of whining that it's not the French Games, it's the Paris Games. You don't know how the rest of us feel. But in bars around the country, I mean, France has won over 50 medals now. And in bars in small towns around the country, really crowds are cheering on Léon Marchand and Teddy Riner and all the others as they win medals. I mean, the athletes are totally perceived as representing all of France.
Michaela, if there is a post-Olympics feel-good factor, I mean, even if Macron would have to be very quick to do anything with it, is there anything he can do with it? Does it improve his position at all as he contemplates the current French political landscape?
So I don't think this improves his position when it comes to, the immediate political conflict. We've seen the political conflict being put on hold, but that will resume immediately, I think, almost exactly in the same terms as 2 weeks ago. I think this will have an impact for sure for Macron and his legacy in the long term. That's what he's hoping for, at least. Today he announced a big day of celebrations mid-September, I think on the 14th of September, exactly 2 months after the big National Day, Bastille Day, so the symbolism is there. I do think he will find himself as stuck as he was before politically.
Simon, on that front, one of the big decisions, in fact, probably the biggest decision he has to make is who is actually going to attempt to run France next. Is it clear yet who the next Prime Minister of this country might be?
Not at all. The left have agreed to support a joint candidate, Lucie Castex, who is a high functionary in Paris Town Hall. This is much more important than it might sound to a foreigner, but she was still completely unknown, so much so that Macron hadn't heard of her when she was proposed. However, neither the left nor the Macronists by themselves are big enough, so they would then have to form a coalition behind one candidate, but forming a coalition goes completely against the grain of French politics, which is that you hate and attack the other side constantly, and you never compromise, and you just shout. And so, whereas in Germany they would have long since agreed a coalition between centre and left, here it's very hard to see how that happens.
I mean, that being the case, Michaela, is it conceivable that we could end up, if not necessarily needing another snap election, but a further reorganisation of the National Assembly? Is there any guarantee, basically, that whatever is the next government of France is actually going to be able to govern France?
No, I mean, essentially there can't be another snap election before 1 year, essentially. That's what the Constitution says. I do think that they will end up finding some kind of solution with, well, in Italy we're quite used to broad coalition governments, and the French have discovered this art de la coalition à l'italienne, these Italian-style coalitions. Not that they particularly love them. They find them quite terrible, and they are possibly right. But as Simon was saying, the level of political conflict that we've seen over the last few years and months really makes it almost impossible to achieve that kind of broad coalition. I do think, though, they will find... Actually, Macron has been working behind the scenes between congratulating one athlete and the other to try and find a path forward, which could entail probably a centrist government with some kind of backing from the conservatives, and hoping that essentially the far left and the far right will not vote for one another's no confidence motions, which is basically the way centrist governments have survived under Macron over the last few years.
Well, while France has been enjoying a holiday from its habitual rancor, elements of the British have taken up the traditional French summer pastime of pelting the police with paving stones. It is sadly unknowable whether or not new UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has been soliciting advice on dealing with civil unrest from his French counterparts, but it does seem to be the case that Sir Keir has made a broadly favourable first impression in French political circles. Granted that he is clearing a low bar, following as he does a Conservative government whose loudest voices would not have been silenced by anything short of bricking up the Channel Tunnel. Simon, as somebody who knows both countries well, do you see a renaissance in Anglo-French relations looming?
Well, absolutely, from an extremely low base. So it started at the D-Day ceremony, where unfortunately Rishi Sunak had an important television interview to give, so he had to leave early. And David Lammy, the Labour Shadow Foreign Secretary at the time, already knew his French counterpart. So he said, I see there's some empty chairs at the ceremony, can we? And so Lammy and Starmer and entourages were installed at the front of the Normandy ceremony. And Macron is delighted, of course, to have a British government that's not against everything. I think all the Europeans are delighted with that. So it's a very, very good start. Whether what they can agree in terms of, reducing the enormous cost of doing business between the countries is going to be minor or major remains to be seen.
Michaela, Macron signalled his enthusiasm for the idea of Starmer pretty early on. He had him round at the LSA Palace, I think, last September. Obviously, by that point, I think Macron, along with everybody else, was assuming that Starmer would be the next Prime Minister and behaving accordingly. But do you get the impression that they do see each other as, ideological fellow travellers?
Yeah, ideologically, I'm not so sure. From a pure chemistry standpoint, yes, there's no doubt about that. As Simon was saying, the bar was very low. We've all seen the memes about Rishi Sunak really hitting it off with Giorgia Meloni, for example, the far-right Italian prime minister. This is stuff that at the Élysée and among French diplomats tends to be noticed. We haven't mentioned, Liz Truss wondering whether France was friend or foe when she was foreign secretary. So yeah, the bar was really low. I think the chemistry is there. As we were saying, there's quite a few stress points between the two countries. It remains to be seen whether this chemistry actually has an impact on those.
But Simon, and again, you see it from both sides, but did the fact of Brexit dramatically change relations between the United Kingdom and France? The two countries, despite what Liz Truss's confusion, have been broadly friends for quite some time. But
200 years.
Exactly. But there is a certain spikiness attending the relationship, which does rear up from time to time.
I think in general, relations have been pretty good. Given that they're both two maritime powers with ambitions beyond their station, to have not fought a war against each other for 200 years, leaving aside some British bombings of the French fleet in World War II, I think is pretty impressive. When Brexit happened, Macron told his people, we're not going to waste any time trying to reverse this. We're not going to argue about this. We have bigger things to be getting on with. So he came in the year after Brexit. He said, we're just not going to spend time on this. Let the Brits do their thing. And France has always been happy to have good relations. But as Michele said, the British Conservatives mostly weren't. Now that there is a new government in London that is desperate to have European friends, Macron says, yeah, fine.
Just to follow that up, Simon, did France's attitude, as far as you noticed, towards the post-Brexit UK change at all throughout that extraordinary churn of prime ministers, Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak? Apologies to anybody I've missed.
Well, there weren't really relations for a long time because, there were almost no summits for years. And the British had this bizarre idea that you could peel off some European countries to take a stance against the EU in the Brexit negotiations. They didn't even try with France. So the EU was perceived to be a kind of French puppet in the Brexit negotiations. And they went to countries like Hungary in particular that they thought might be more sympathetic to the British point of view, got absolutely nowhere with that. So on the Conservative side, France was seen as the baddie, whereas Macron was just saying, the single market we totally have to protect. We can't have any holes in the single market, which is what the Brexiteers wanted. So I don't think that Macron was ever anti-British. His policy was always very pro-French.
Michele, did it strike you that the outbreak of, the escalation of war in Ukraine in February 2022, did that change things? Did that make, and this obviously at a time when Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but did that perhaps make both France and the United Kingdom realise that there are more important things in play right now? Yeah,
I would say that combined now with the spectre of Trump winning in the US again, I think that's one of the main driving forces of this rapprochement between the two countries when it comes to defense. We know that Starmer is particularly keen to kind of build new levels of cooperation on defense with the EU and with France in particular. I'm not positive that this would not have been the case with the Conservatives in power if Trump wins the election in a few months' time.
Simon, do you foresee, though, any needle on that front, especially where defence is concerned? Because it's been pretty clear since Brexit that Macron, who I don't think has ever lacked a sense of the grandeur of the office he inhabits, but he now regards the President of France as Europe's default leader. And he does, of course, have a case, France being now the only country which is in EU, NATO, and on the permanent five of the Security Council. Is there still a thing, do you think, where France and the United Kingdom regard each other as in competition for that title?
I think that they might have strangely come together more than ever before. So the UK view was always, well, the US leads in Europe. And the French view is, no, we should do it without the US. We should lead in Europe. And if Trump is re-elected, well, that question sort of resolves itself. The US is not going to be here with us. And so then the Macron idea of a kind of strategic autonomy, as he calls it, the Europeans leading their own defense, that just becomes what we have to do. And then Britain and France are the two most important countries on that. The other place they came together is that Macron was much more friendly with Putin than the UK was for many years. So even when the war begins, Macron is on the phone with Putin. Macron talked previously about no peace in Russia without Putin, no Europe without Russia. And it was only after a few months of this, when he realized that Putin was beyond reach and the Eastern Europeans had been shouting at him, "You are an idiot," that he switched to an extremely pro-Ukraine foreign policy, which is now very close to British policy. So I would say that, especially if Trump wins, the UK and France will be closer together on these issues than at any previous moment.
Well, let's return to the subject of the Olympic city and of the many stereotypes which have attached themselves to France and to Paris in particular. Probably chief among them is a reputation for froideur. This is such that years ago, when an Australian newspaper ran a competition for bogus travel advice to offer naive tourists, the winner was that when a Parisian pretended not to hear any inquiry you made in English, it was merely a quaint local tradition, to which the correct response was to grasp them firmly by the shoulder and say, "Hey mate, are you deaf or something?" However, and as has been much reported, Paris and France during the Olympics have absolutely not been like that. Parisians have been downright friendly and the French cheering on their team downright enthusiastic. Michaela, have you been surprised by this?
I have to say, it's hard to make foreigners understand the level of grumpiness and reluctance ahead of the Olympics that you could breathe in the streets of Paris. There was a lot of like negative buzz, I have to say, on a lot of fronts, from complaints about the metro system being overwhelmed to prices going through the roof. All that has been completely brushed aside almost on day one. I don't know to what extent that has to do with the Olympics themselves, and to what extent that's due more to the sporting successes of France and French athletes, which have been incredible. And so I have to say, I have been surprised. I would say, the French will always remain the French. They love to complain and be grumpy and so forth, but then they know how to throw a good party.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, Simon, how big a part of that has been the success of the French team at these games? As we go to air, they have won only 4 fewer gold medals than Australia.
Yeah, well, Australia is lucky that swimming is like 60% of the Olympics.
You work with what's put in front of you.
I think when you host the Olympics in 2032, I see swimming, Australian rules, football, and maybe a bit of rugby, and then cricket.
Well, we can only hope. I mean, I would travel a long way to see that. But would it have been different, do you think, if things had not gone quite so well for the French actually at the Games?
Look, I mean, France is a country that invests a lot in all sports. So there's a lot of government money for even weirdo sports. And it's a country where there are sports complexes everywhere. It's a traditional sports country, and the host always wins a lot of medals, because often as a home team athlete, you're competing in places where you have competed many times before, which is an enormous advantage. And the crowd likes you.
But on the response, Michaela, of Parisians to the visitors who've come in, was there a particular moment when you noticed something unusual was going on? For me, it was when one of our Monocle team colleagues here breathlessly reported that they had seen not just a police officer, but a CRS officer quite cheerfully giving somebody what were apparently correct directions in English.
That's quite surprising indeed. I have not seen that, I have to say. No, I mean, what can I say? The atmosphere has been excellent, and there is some grumpiness still lingering when it comes to business owners, restaurateurs, hotel owners who are saying actually our numbers are down, our business is down, and for example, today I believe the Paris authorities gave a presser saying, don't worry, like there's going to be massive benefits in the long term. Like this is a massive advertisement for France and for Paris.
Yeah, because hardly anybody ever came to Paris before.
Exactly. Well, that's their argument.
Simon, was any official encouragement made to Parisians to sort of try and plaster on a smile during these games?
If you go back through the decades, there are often initiatives that, for example, tell taxi drivers to be nice to customers, which in the history of Paris has never yet happened. I would say that there was a break after the pandemic, or with the pandemic, that when the lockdowns ended, I noticed that there was more informality. You could go out wearing more casual clothes. People used the informal tu more than the formal vous. Younger people, I sometimes see them doing this thing with their face, which is smiling, which I've been unable to recognize after years living here. So I do think that Paris had actually relaxed into a slightly more globalized mode of not being angry all the time.
Michaela, can we attempt optimism on this? Do you expect it to last?
No, I do not. I think
you've been living in Paris a long time.
Exactly.
Clearly,
I really see these Olympics as a wonderful time that's gonna come to an end pretty abruptly, and I believe London was a similar story, right? Like the city went back to business as usual pretty quickly.
It really, really did. But we can enjoy this while it is still lasting. And before we let you both go, I did want to ask you both in turn. I'll ask you first, Simon. Any choice of actual Olympic highlight or Olympic adjacent highlight? What will you remember from this?
I grew up in Holland. I will remember going to the Holland-Belgium women's hockey match. Holland won, and they won gold. And they won gold in the men's. But anyway, and the very cheery Dutch and Belgian crowd sort of doing joint chants, Holland, België, sort of being loving to each other. That was a highlight for me.
Michaela, what about you?
Well, I haven't seen any competitions like physically yet, but I'm going to see some water polo tomorrow, so we'll see how that pans out. Other than that, I would say Italy's amazing win in fencing, the women's team épée final against France. That was definitely my highlight.
Well, on that upbeat note, which is in keeping, I think, with the spirit of these games, however temporary it may prove to be, Michele Barbero and Simon Cooper, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the Paris Games saw the welcoming of an entire new sport into the Olympic pantheon, breaking, a competitive adaptation of breakdancing. If I've read it right, the B-Girls quarterfinals are underway more or less right now. Well, earlier I spoke to Martin Gilian, aka MGbility of the World Dance Sport Federation. I began by asking him how long the process has been to get breaking to the Games as an Olympic sport.
I think breaking was confirmed first for the Youth Olympic Games, maybe 1 year before the Youth Olympic Games, which was in 2018 in Buenos Aires. And since it was pretty successful over there, then Paris decided to include breaking in the Olympic Games 2024. So I would say 6-7 years.
And once that process is underway, how do you actually go about assembling the competition? How do the various countries put their breaking teams together?
So the federation, the World Dance Sport Federation, had to create or standardize rules because there were no rules before. We had a lot of cultural events, but without rules, so like we had to create a lot of rules, and we're improving from competition to competition. And basically the events were organized by a national member body of the federation. So there was some formula which was like centralized, and it was passed down to the national member bodies that were organizing the competition that were part of the qualification for the Olympic Games.
Was that a difficult process, though, deciding on what the rules are going to be? Because I guess with sports that we're used to, we just assume the rules have always been there. We kind of forget that at some point people must have sat down and thought, well, how are we going to make this work?
Yeah, it was definitely challenging. We had to put a lot of heads together from the sport world, but also from the breaking world to make sure that it's gonna be working. And along the way, we're improving a lot of rules that maybe were not working that well. So it was a long journey, and we keep innovating and making sure that the rules are as fair as possible. But I think by now we really are at the highest possible level as far as the rules that ever been in breaking.
So for listeners who may be tuning in to watch competitive breaking for the first time, can you give us a basic rundown of what those rules are?
So for example, the judging system. The judging system before Youth Olympics was very simple. Like the judges were just pointing hands which side was better based on whatever personal criteria they had. So now we standardize these criteria. Now we have 5 criteria, each represents 20% of the total grade, and basically the judges need to also explain themselves if there is any bias or possible bias, then explain within the criteria why the dancer was better for them, you know. So for example, the judging system was standardized, then the number of rounds, the overall battle format, like pre-selection to top 32 to round robin, like for example top 16, and majority of the cultural events is just a knockout format. You battle 2 or 3 rounds, and whoever wins the battle advances to quarterfinals. But the Olympic format for breaking, for example, for top 16 is round robin, which means 4 groups of 4 dancers. So the battle format had to be standardized, you know, again, the judging system, many things, like for example, which side will start a battle. We didn't really have that. Like sometimes the host would come and spin the bottle, whatever the bottle was pointing, that side need to start, right? But now we have a rule, blue and red side. Whoever's on the blue side can start a battle. If he or she doesn't start a battle in the first 10 seconds, then the red side need to start. And the color allocation is randomized by the computer.
Is it correct, though, that they can't choose their own music, that they have to just adapt to whatever the DJ throws at them?
Exactly. This is the responsibility of the DJ. So the DJ is curating the playlist. He's choosing the tracks. They have no idea what songs will be played. But breakers are really kind of like freestylers. They know kind of what to expect and when they can expect the break, like the pause in the music where they can do a freeze and emphasize that the pause in a song. So they're very well trained for musicality, for example. So I wouldn't say it's a big disadvantage. Actually, sometimes it's even better not to know music, because then you might choreograph your round too much. But if you don't know what music there is a moment of surprise. You can improvise, and it can really help you to show off your musicality skills, for example.
So is this, do you think, a point of difference between breaking and maybe other dance-related disciplines in the Olympics, like maybe, well, ice skating at the Winter Olympics, synchronized swimming at these Olympics, that it's not choreographed, that you are placing a premium on the improvisation of the contestants?
Exactly, like you never know what's going to happen. So this is why it's very attractive for the audience, because if you see the choreography, of course, it's beautiful if you do it from A to Z, like perfectly. But in breaking, of course, some moves or combinations of moves are trained, but you never know when you're gonna use it. So depending on the music, the athlete or the dancer or the breaker is choosing which move set he or she is going to use. So again, anything can happen. This is like really authentic. It's kind of sometimes watching like a fighting, but without touching each other, you know.
And ahead of these games, were any particular countries looking like they might be the Olympic Games inaugural breaking powerhouses?
Definitely. United States of America, France, the Netherlands, Japan, Ukraine. I mean, I would say these 5 countries are definitely top-notch for both genders.
This is obviously, I think, something people associate with when breaking or breakdancing was a huge cultural thing with maybe the mid-80s to early 90s. But it's never gone away, right?
It never gone away. It kind of stopped to be trendy in the United States. It kind of little died out in the US, but then within that time, breaking spread into Asia and Europe, and then kind of like there's some European breakers are getting credit for re-inspiring the United States in the 90s. So since then, again, in the US, it's a big thing, and all around the world, I think there is not one country where you don't see breakers. Even in North Korea, you have breakers. So this is how diverse and worldwide this is.
And in Slovakia too, presumably. So what was the beginning of your interest in the form?
So for example, I mean, I saw breaking in the music video clip from the 1990s in the US, and I saw some breakers doing these crazy moves. I was like, what is this? I want to really learn this. And when I moved to the United States to study at university, I was super lucky because in South Florida at that time was the best breaking scene. And so I was exposed to the source, or I was discussing with the pioneers of breaking from the 1970s and 80s. They were explaining to me the values of the breaking and hip hop culture, showing me some moves. So I got the first-hand experience, and then I actually brought the American event to my country. Now we have a festival with 94 countries representing and enjoying breaking and the hip hop culture.
That was Martin Gillian, aka MGbility of the World Dance Sport Federation, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Michele Barbero and Simon Cooper. Today's show was produced by Laura Kramer. Our sound engineer was David Stevens, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons in London. Special thanks to Tom Webb and Carlotta Rebello. I'm Andrew Muller here in Paris. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday from our usual studio at Midori House in London. For now, from Maison Allianz at the Soho Hotel. Thanks for listening.